Things change. That's one of the truisms of life. And it's one of the things that all of us have a difficult time dealing with. Change makes us uncomfortable. Change, particularly over time, sometimes leaves us feeling a bit nostalgia for things that we've lost in the past. Now, change takes place in personal lives and it takes place in our surroundings. And one of the changes, particularly those that you notice if you've lived any place for a long time, is how much our surroundings change. Buildings come and go, businesses come and go. And, well, sometimes you find a call for, why can't we go back there? We obviously can't. Change is going to happen. All that I would hope for is that change goes in positive directions. That when we tear a building down, when we create something new, that it's for the better. And what I want to introduce you to is a number of buildings that have disappeared in Westfield. I call them the lost mansions because these were homes not of ordinary people in Westfield. These were homes of wealthy people in their own day. They were in most cases large, imposing structures. Most of them disappeared within modern memory. Most of them disappeared because they were getting old, they were getting run down, they weren't wanted anymore, and certainly everyone expected that what was going to replace them would be something better. It didn't happen that way. What I want to do is remind people that Westfield is a community of homes, many of them wonderful homes that make us what we are, and we want to think very, very carefully when we start losing what's left. Now, it's true that these homes that I'm showing you, they're selective, and that's because these images are based upon the collections of the Westfield Athenaeum. That means that we only have pictures of some of them. The dates are imprecise in some cases about when they were built and when they disappeared. But they do tell an important story about Westfield. Now, Westfield became an official community 350 years ago in 1669. Immediately, a few homes were built. Today, there is only one that I'm aware of that survives from that era. But there are quite a number of homes from the 1700s still in Westfield, and literally hundreds of homes that were built in the 1800s. Here are a few that we have lost. This is one of the most interesting of homes. As you can see, it's a pillared house. They call it Greek Revival when you get these big two-story pillars. Unlike most Greek Revival homes in New England, this had pillars on 3 sides. Now, there are still a few of these Greek Revival homes left in Westfield. There is a story that they were built by Chauncey Shepherd, a builder and architect from Springfield. He was the grandson of General William Shepherd. We don't know for sure whether he's the one that's built them, but most people in town say that this is a Chauncey Shepherd home. It was built sometime in the 1830s and disappeared prior to 1819. We know that in 1819, a garage was on that site. Now, this site is the corner of Mechanic and Main Street. And today, it's occupied by a Burger King restaurant. Obviously, we didn't make much improvement in that case. The second home is a colonial home built probably circa 1750, 1760. This is the Azariah Mosley House. It was on East Silver Street, the corner of Coleman Avenue. In about 1900, the house was moved back on the property. Now, you're going to hear me say that on a number of these houses. You want to remember that prior to the modern era, prior to electricity, modern plumbing, sewage hookups, and modern tractor trailers and traffic on highways, it was fairly easy to simply jack a house up on its supporting timbers, put rollers under it, hook a couple of teams of oxen to it, and pull it through relatively empty streets. So houses got moved instead of being destroyed prior to 1900. This house was moved back on Coleman Avenue and survived probably into about 1950 or 51. Now, it had one of those very ornate carved doors on the front. They're called Connecticut Valley doors. The famous one on the Fowler Tavern on Main Street was taken to New York City and is in the Metropolitan Museum. No one seems to know what happened to this one. Probably it was simply cast away, because we do know it was taken off in 1938. This is what occupies that site today. This is the corner of Coleman Avenue. It is the parking lot for a building that originally was Westfield Woodworking. Today it is an electrical contractor's office. The third of the homes sat almost directly across the street from the Westfield Athenaeum. Actually, the room where I'm sitting today. This is the Falley Atwater Holland House. It again is a late colonial house, probably 1780s or so, built by Falley, the famous Falley of the Falley muskets, the Falley arsenal. His blacksmith shop sat on this property. After he died, it was inherited by his daughter and eventually came into the hands of one of the town's early doctors, a Dr. Atwater. It eventually went into the hands of another family of doctors, the Holland family that I've talked about. And James Holland, actually you can see James Holland standing on the street in front of this photograph. James Holland lived here until about 1875. At that time, the Methodists decided they wanted to build a new church for themselves. And so this home was pulled back on the property. It became Holland Avenue, and the Methodist church was constructed on that site. Now, the Methodist church that was there was torn down in the late 1960s, and it is the site of the current Methodist church on Court Street, directly across from the Westfield Athenaeum. This home is the Hiram Harrison House. Now, it originally was built by General Thomas Sheldon. General Sheldon, he was a general in the Massachusetts militia. Sheldon was a contractor. He built the famous canal through Westfield. He built the extension from Southwick to Westfield. He went bankrupt doing it, by the way. And he built this house for himself next to the canal. In fact, if you look very, very closely down in this corner, you can see what looks like a mud puddle. This is the edge of the canal where it sat on Main Street. The house was built somewhere in the early 1830s. By 1836, Sheldon was bankrupt and fled to Texas, the new Texas Republic, where he hoped to recoup his business in stores in Houston, Texas. He died shortly after he got there. His widow lived in the house taking boarders for a few years, and then she sold it to Hiram Harrison. Harrison is famous in town as one of the biggest whip makers in town. His whip factory, the American Whip Factory, was just up the street on Main Street. He could easily walk to work. And he lived in this house all of his life. Now, this house survived at least until 1943. The house became obscured in 1900 when the canal railroad, the railroad ran along the canal and replaced the canal, and the railroad was elevated. It is the embankment that runs through town. So there are later photographs of this house where you can just see the top of the house over the railroad embankment. The last record we have here of the house is in 1943, when it was still standing. So probably it disappeared in the post-World War II modernization, and we ended up with a gas station and Cumberland Farm store replacing it. The oldest house in the grouping is another Main Street house. This is the Whiting Mansion / Maudsley Mansion / Mosley Mansion. Joseph Whiting came to Westfield almost immediately after Westfield was settled by fur traders with the Indians. And in 1670, he hired Joseph Maudsley of Windsor, Connecticut, to build him a house and store on this property. This was the first store commercial property in Westfield in 1670. Within a couple of years, Joseph Maudsley bought out his boss, Joseph Whiting's rights, and he settled here, and this was his house. Over the next few years, there were additions and reconstructions. The image that you see in this picture probably represents a house built somewhere in the 1730s. And somewhere along the line, Maudsley became Mosley, which is a very famous first family in Westfield. Mosley School and Mosley Street and all the rest. Mosley's continued to occupy the property for over 100 years. It lasted and lasted and lasted. By the early 21st century, it had become rental property and had deteriorated rather badly. Even though it was a classic colonial home, the fact of the matter was it existed on the corner of a very, very busy downtown street, and it was in bad shape. And so in 2005, it was torn down, and the colonial condominiums were built in its place. This site, which was also, by the way, the site of the first schoolhouse in Westfield and the first Congregational church, is now occupied by a series of condominiums. There is, however, a historical plaque on the corner. Another colonial home is from Broad Street. This is the Sackett Bingham Kittredge home, probably built by the Sacketts, which were another original family. Again, mid-18th century, 1750s, 1760s, something like that. Bingham, who was one of the owners of the home, ran the Park Square Hotel in the 19th century, a very famous establishment on the Green throughout much of the 19th century. In the early 20th century, it became home of the Kittredges. Kittredge was the principal of the high school for 20 years. So the home has had rather important visitors. This home also has a bit of notoriety attached to it because in 2003, in an overnight maneuver, the home was demolished without much awareness of the public. And there was a great deal of controversy when a local insurance agent tore it down and built offices there. The front entrance, which again was another one of these Connecticut Valley doors, was saved and put on this commercial establishment, but it left a bad taste in the mouth of people in town, and for a time at least, created a revival of preservationist interests. Another street of older homes in town that has seen a lot of demolition was Franklin Street. This home is another of the town's famous Greek revivals, built probably in the 1830s. This is known as the Hiram Hull House. Now, Hiram Hull was another one of the founders and major businessmen in the whip industry. Hiram Hull has a great deal of fame because if Westfield ever participated in the Underground Railroad, it's because of Hiram Hull. His name is attached to whatever activity may or may not have existed. Hull was a Methodist, and Methodists in those days were known as great reformers. He was also in favor of temperance and women's rights, all fairly unpopular issues in the mid-19th century. But as one of the town's biggest businessmen, he could get away with it. Hiram Hull is also noted as the man who defended the original Catholics in town. Now, this is New England. This was Yankee, Congregationalist, Protestant New England. And when the Irish immigrants first began to flood into the area, there was an enormous anti-Irish, anti-Catholic movement. It led, in fact, to a political party in the United States in the 1850s called the Know Nothing Party. And, in fact, the Know Nothings won every political office in Massachusetts in the 1850s. The Irish Catholics in town felt they needed a church, and in the early 1850s began the process of constructing what would be St. Mary's. The good Yankees decided they weren't going to have anything like that in their town, and a mob went down to burn the structure down. The story is told that Hiram Hull met the mob, faced them down, and said, "I know you, Bill, I know you, Joe, you work for me, and if you want to continue working tomorrow, you'll go home." At least that's the way the story is told. This is the Hiram Hull House. It survived into the 1950s when urban renewal decided to wipe out almost all of the houses on Franklin Street, and so this was torn down. Of course, there were positive replacements. We got another gas station. Now, this next building, it was not a private house, but it was such an important and imposing structure for much of Westfield, I think it ought to be included. This is the Hamden House, or the Gad Palmer Tavern. It sat on the north side of the Green. That would be the north side of Main Street. It sat where the Second Congregational Church used to sit. Today, there is a parking lot there between a failed bank and a sub shop. But this was the Gad Palmer Tavern, built probably about 1816. In the late 1850s, the First Congregational Church building was too small for the congregation. And so the members decided to build a new church. They, in fact, built the brick church, which sits there today. But again, it would be too small for the congregation. So the decision was made to split the congregation. and create a first and second congregational church. So the second group decided to build their own church, and they built it on the north side of the green, while the first built on the east side of the green. The Gad Palmer Tavern was then pulled back on the property, back about a full block to what is today Thomas Street. And there it became a rooming house, an apartment house, gradually falling down in status and over the years becoming more and more deteriorated until 1934, when it was torn down and disappeared and the parking lot replaces it. Court Street saw another of the Greek Revival houses. This was another quite impressive one. This is the Razor Smith House. Reuben Smith was his name. His nickname in town is Razor Smith. We don't seem to know very much about him. Most of what survives are rumors about his reputation, which was rather unsavory. He supposedly was a gambler. He got the nickname Razor because in those days there was very little paper money. Most of the money was coinage, and it was silver and gold. And people used to clip the coins, that is, shave tiny little pieces of silver and gold off the edges. And if you did that with enough silver and gold coins, you would accumulate extra money. So he was called Razor Smith because it was believed that that's what he did. Anyway, he built this beautiful Greek Revival home on Court Street. It sat right where City Hall is today. In the 1890s, the Westfield Normal School had badly outgrown its property, and it wanted a new building, and so the decision was this would be the appropriate site. Now, unlike what I said about the other buildings, this one was not torn down. In fact, this building still survives, but in a rather unique form. What they did is they cut this building into two pieces. You can see it's an L-shaped building, and they cut it in two pieces. They moved it up the street and across the street. Now, across the street, there is a little street called Holcomb Street. It goes down to the Westfield Parks and Rec building. And there's a little narrow street down there that's underneath the hill where the hospital sits. And there are two houses in there, which are the remains of Reuben Smith's mansion. Here's one, and next to it is this one. Now, you have to look closely, but if you look at this one with the pillars, you can see that it is this right-hand side of this building. This one, of course, doesn't look anything like anything, except if you take this left-hand side, cut the pillars off, and put a front down here, you get this building. And in fact, if you go down and look at the two side by side, and look at the left-hand side of this house, you will see it clearly was not built as a house, that it is a cut-off side. It's a rather unique saving, in a strange kind of way, of one of these mansions. Meanwhile, back on Franklin Street, while urban renewal took down the Hiram Hall house, next to it was this house. This is a federal brick house, probably about 1810. This was the Kellogg home. It was torn down in 1957 along with the Hiram Hull House. The Hiram Hull House was replaced with a gas station. This one became a dollar store. Well, it was the A&P supermarket before it was the dollar store. When I came to town 50 years ago, this was an A&P supermarket. But it became a parking lot commercial establishment. One of the later mansions that was destroyed was from Noble Street. This is, as known in town as the Mary Noble House, actually was built by her father, Reuben Noble, in 1878. This part of town, off East Silver, this part of town was the Noble farm lot. It had been in the Noble hands for a couple of hundred years. Reuben Noble was a very prosperous tobacco farmer in town. He built this mansion in 1878 for he and his wife, Annette Noble. Annette is fairly well, she's not well known in town. She should be. She was a doctor. She was one of the very, very early women to get an MD degree. She got a degree in the 1870s. She practiced medicine in Westfield for 50 years. They donated the money to build Noble Hospital, today known as Bay State Noble, but they provided the funds for that. They had a single daughter, Mary, who also was highly educated. She had a law degree from early in the 20th century, practiced law her entire life. Mary never married. There were no other direct relatives. And so Mary thought she was doing a good thing. She donated this property, her property, to the city for the benefit of senior citizens. She assumed that her home would be used for that. The city chose not to do that. The city chose to allow this home to be derelict. And I live not very far from this home, and I watched pigeons go in and out of broken windows and under the roof, and I actually went to the city at one point in time and offered to buy it because I loved the home. But I was informed that the city was going to do something someday for the senior citizens. Ultimately, vagrants got into the home, and in 1997 they burned it to the ground. Well, eventually something was done. Once the city saved the need of doing anything with the mansion, they bulldozed the property and ultimately built the Westfield Senior Center on the property. I'm not sure whether there's any memory of Mary Noble and the Noble family there, but that's where it came from. Another one of the later mansions is from Court Street. This is the Major Bush house. Major is a title. He's again a major in the Mass militia. This is the corner of Bush and Broad Street. It replaced an earlier colonial home. The original home was the home of Pliny Mosley. Now, Pliny isn't terribly important, but Pliny had a daughter, Sybil. I've already talked about Sybil because Sybil is the religious young woman who marries Hiram Bingham and goes off and forms the Hawaiian missions. And this is where her home was. We have had descendants of the family come from Hawaii, and I took them down to the corner. Unfortunately, I couldn't show them pictures of their ancestors' home because we have none. It disappeared so long ago. This home was built in the 1870s. It has the classic mansard roof. That's that slate, strange-looking, cut-off, flat-top roof. They're very, very famous. This is a French architectural form The French invented it in the 1850s. It's closely associated with Napoleon III and his rebuilding of France. It became very popular in the United States in the 1860s and 70s. And there are a number of homes with this kind of roof here in Westfield. You can easily identify the age by the roof line. This mansard roof home lasted until 1960, when it was torn down and an apartment block was built in its place. Broad Street was the home of many of the mansions that we want to talk about. It really got developed in the 19th century, and throughout much of the 19th century, many of the most prosperous families in town built large homes on the street. This is one of them. This is the Horton home. Again, a mansard roof home built in the 1870s. It replaced an earlier colonial home that was there. This home didn't survive very long. It was torn down in 1910. It's one of the earliest to be destroyed, and it was destroyed to build a thoroughly modern mansion by Joseph Ely. Now, Joseph Ely was the son, an attorney, the son of a famous family of attorneys here in town. His father's house was next door. Joseph built this mansion. Joseph went on to become governor of Massachusetts. In 1958, after his death, this home was taken over for the town's first nursing home. And with a good bit of modernization and redesign over the years, it survives today as the Governor's Center nursing home. But it once was the site of at least two of the classic vanished mansions in Westfield. Now, Westfield had two examples of an extremely unique kind of American architectural design. One of the silliest architectural designs that anybody ever had, the octagon craze. I'm not quite sure why this design was created. I'll tell you that the interior of these homes were very strange. One of these two Octagon houses survives. It's on King Street. Most people who live in town are not aware of it, and you really have to know what you're looking for if you go down the street. But if you do go to, the best way is to go to the Westfield City Hall, go to the parking lot in the back. King Street is the street that runs behind the City Hall, and walk and look at the house. It's still there. This one is not. This is the other example. This one is the Mary Rood H.B. Smith house. It was built on Upper Court Street by Mary Rood in about 1865. Within 3 years, H.B. Smith, the famous cast iron boiler maker's industrialist in town, bought it, and he added the third story, the mansard roof third story. He also, at that time, H.B. Smith made ornate cast iron ironwork for decoration and fences, and he made all the cast iron that went around the porches. Now, this was quite an interesting home on Upper Court Street. It lasted until 1949, when it burned. The remains of the house were bought by Harry Belden, who was a contractor in town. And he took the timbers and the cast iron work from the house, and he went down on Franklin Street. And he went out Franklin Street just beyond the Armory. If you go up Franklin Street today, keep the Armory on your right, just beyond the Armory is a little one-story brown house, and it has porch all across the front with cast iron ironwork. That's Harry Belden's house that he built there with the remains of this. Now, Harry Belden has some other fame. He built a inn hotel further out Franklin Street. It's called the Sheraton Inn. Originally it was the Belden Inn, the Sheraton Inn. When I came to town 50 years ago, that was one of the better places in town to eat and drink. Ultimately, the college bought that property. It had originally planned on expanding down onto that area of Route 20, but it never did. Now, the Octagon House sat on this corner of Mill and Court Street in Westfield before it burned. Court was the home of another mansard roof mansion. This is the Loomis Keep Parks home, built by the Loomises. The Keep family came to town. By the way, the Keeps were another family whose money helped build what is today the hospital. There originally were two hospitals there. There was the Noble Hospital and the Keep Hospital. The Keep name has disappeared. Ultimately, about 1900, this property was bought by Parks. Parks was a crooked insurance man who made his money in the collapse of one of the town's insurance companies and then invested his money in the Parks block. I've talked about it in the professional building fire, but this is where he lived until his death. After his death, this building was torn down in 1927 and an apartment block was built on the site. Back on Broad Street, another mansion. This is the Henry Ely home. This is the father of Joseph Ely, and it was the next door property. Again, this home replaced an earlier house. This home survived until 1957, and it was torn down, and St. John's Lutheran Church was built in its place. Another Broad Street home was the Lamberton House. This one was built about 1875. Now that tower, that round tower that you see here, that originally was a square tower. But about 3 years after the house was built, it caught fire. And when they rebuilt the house, they rebuilt this as a round tower. Lamberton was originally involved in the whip business, then became involved in real estate, and that's where he really made his money, and he built this house. This house has a certain amount of fame. It's claimed that this was the first house in Westfield to have a thoroughly modern bathroom with running water, hot and cold, and a flush toilet. Don't know whether it's true or not, but that's one of the claims about this house. Now, this house survived until quite recent times. It was torn down in 2006 and became the parking lot for East Hampton Savings Bank. Behind the house was a carriage barn, and the carriage barn was an 18th century building. Now, the contractors who tore down the Lamberton House were aware that they had something unique and golden in the carriage barn, and so they took that apart very carefully. The timbers were moved to Connecticut, and somewhere in Connecticut, someone, probably some dot-com millionaire or Wall Street attorney, has probably got a very expensive rebuilt colonial home or carriage barn from the carriage house that used to sit behind this house. Another of the architectural wonders of Westfield is called Italianate. That means kind of a flat roof, square, but gewgaws and gables and all kinds of odds and ends. This is the Gillette House. It sat right next door to this library. Edward Bates Gillette was the son-in-law of James Fowler, and the James Fowler House is the boys and girls library, the children's library, which makes up part of the Westfield Athenaeum. His father-in-law gave him a piece of the outlying property, and he built this house in 1853 and raised his family there. The last direct descendant of that family, Miss Lucy, as she was fondly known in town, she never married. She lived here the last of her life. In her last few years, this house had a couple of minor fires, which did interior damage. She continued to live in the house. The house was saved each time, but there was some damage. On her death in 1951, the house was torn down and Waranoco Bank was built on the property. Now, Waranoco a few years ago became Berkshire Bank. It has expanded and torn down a couple of other houses around it to create parking lots. But it was the end of another of the great mansions of Court Street. On the opposite side of Court Street, they built Victorian Gothics. This is the Bush Miller House. It sat on the corner of Court and Pleasant. It replaced an earlier colonial house, which was moved and survives to this day on Holland Avenue. This house was built in 1876. It paralleled a house almost exactly like it next door, built by James Holland. This is one of those huge, old, rambling Gothic mansions that are sort of Adam's family claim to fame. I mean, it's a shame these kind of homes disappeared, but you can kind of understand it. They were big, they were terrible to heat, they were expensive to keep up. If they had survived, they're impressive, but there's a problem. It was built by the Bush family, came to be owned by Ira Miller, who was a major figure in the whip industry in Westfield for many, many years. Eventually, it was bought by the members of the Episcopal congregation, the Church of Atonement, and for 27 years, this is where they held church services. Finally, they had accumulated enough money to build a more appropriate building, and in the 1950s, they tore that Gothic monstrosity down and built this castle-like structure. One unusual structure for the other. Now, the biggest mansion that was ever built in Westfield was the Thayer Mansion on Broad Street. Unfortunately, we don't have any good pictures of it. Now, it's really strange. For a number of generations, the Thayer family was one of the most prominent families of Westfield. The mansion was well known. Descendants of the Thayer family are all over the United States today. A number of them are very interested in family history. But it was only a few years ago that these few distant, almost snapshots of the house appeared. And the Thayer family does not seem to have any better pictures. This house was built in 1867. Now, it's kind of unusual for another reason. The Lucius Thayer, who built this house, was married to Hiram Harrison's daughter. Now, you may remember Hiram Harrison was one of the biggest whip manufacturers in Westfield. Hiram Harrison's daughter's dowry paid for this house. Now, I say that because most unusually, this house was in her name, not her husband's name. The house was huge. It had, depending on how you counted the tower rooms, 28 to 30 rooms. It had 15 formal bedrooms. The dining room held a T-shaped table that seated 36 people. The double parlor that had pocket doors was 32 feet long by 19 feet wide. It was huge. It had formal gardens and grounds around it, including a fountain in the front yard. By the way, that fountain survives. After the house was destroyed, decades later, the fountain was found in some cast-off junk in the city yard. When the Westfield Gaslight District was recreated just a few years ago, the fountain was restored, and it was erected behind the School Street Bistro Tavern Wings restaurant on School Street. It's in their parking lot in the back. Now, this was another one of those houses in town where the last descendant was an elderly maiden lady. Mary Thayer continued to live in it long after the rest of the relatives had moved out of town. The house was way too big for her. Vandals appeared and set fire to outbuildings. And so what they did in the 1940s, this is a kitchen wing right here, this smaller structure. They cut that kitchen wing off and moved it to the front of the property. And she continued to live in that kitchen wing for a few years. The huge house was torn down. On her death in 1957, that kitchen wing was torn down, and today it is the Big Y parking lot. The Big Y store itself sits about where the original house sat. The drugstore, which is at the front of the property, was where the wing sat. Those of you who have lived in town for a number of years may remember that there was a huge old beech tree next to that drugstore, and that was part of what was left of the formal grounds. There's one last mansion that didn't quite vanish. This is another one of those Court Street mansions. This is the Henry Taylor home, and it was the last built of all the houses I've talked about. This one wasn't built until 1895. Henry Taylor made his money in tobacco and cigars. The tobacco industry, the cigar industry, was once upon a time one of the second or third biggest industries in town. On Taylor's death, this house became the property of the Knights of Columbus. They had a hard time keeping it up. And in the 1930s, the YMCA, which had a property on Elm Street, was looking to build a much larger and more complex institution that could provide a greater variety of services. Lucy Gillette's brother, Frederick Gillette, who also had no direct descendants, he didn't marry until into his 50s, and married the widow of another legislator. Frederick Gillette, of course, was famous. He was Speaker of the House of Representatives in the 1920s, and then was senator from Massachusetts, congressman for many, many years. The Gillettes left a very large estate, and they left it to the YMCA. So Mary, who survived her brother, agreed to add $100,000 to that very large estate in order to buy an appropriate property for the YMCA. She bought this house, and the house became the YMCA. Now, in subsequent years, there have been additions to that property. But this is one of the few vanished mansions that was repurposed and survives in some fashion today. If you go into this section, you can recognize very clearly that it once was a home. Most of these buildings are gone. They are never coming back. What's probably important to take out of this is that there remain in Westfield a number of wonderful homes. Some of them are deteriorating today. Some of them look like they can disappear at any moment. Just before they do, I think we want to look at them very, very carefully and see if maybe they couldn't be repurposed. See if maybe it wouldn't be better for the future for them to survive, because it creates a tone and an image for a community to have homes like this, which represent the history and the quality of life in the community.